Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our show, the 10,000 Heroes Club, the 10,000 Heroes Show. I'm your host, Ankur Shah Delight, and today my guest is Casper Kuile. And Casper describes himself on LinkedIn, which is where I first saw him described, as a gay atheist who went to divinity school. He's a theologian, he's a community builder, a community creator, podcaster. He's got an amazing sense of humor and voice and depth of spiritual inquiry. So this interview is I've had just a really great run of guests, I have to say, and Casper is one of them. We also talk about the recent situation in the evolution of the situation in El Salvador with my mentor John Giuliano being there. And we also talk about this idea that I recently presented at the Northwest Dispute Resolution Conference, which is how to prevent a civil war, V1. And it's an idea for a social dialogue or civic dialogue or community gathering that I'm exploring. If you're on my newsletter, you know that already, and maybe you're interested in exploring it too. So we talk about that a little bit. Casper poops all over the idea, and we have a really wonderful discussion about it. All right, here we go. All right, welcome to the show, Casper. I'm very excited to have you on 10,000 Heroes. And as I just mentioned to you, I learned something the other day, which is that I listened to a podcast. It was actually on AI alignment. And the host asked the guest to introduce themselves. And I've never done that. I always just jump right in. But as a listener, I felt like, oh, this is good. I have a sense of who this guest is. So I'm going to learn from that. And I'd love if you could introduce yourself to our audience, and then we'll jump in.
Sure, yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me. So my name's Casper ter Kuile. I was born and raised in the UK to Dutch parents. And my work these days is really thinking about the future of community and spirituality. I grew up in a non-religious home, but ended up finding my way to Harvard Divinity School and studying how religion is changing, especially in the United States. Where for the first time more than half the country doesn't attend a congregation. So we're in the midst of these really drastic shifts on a macro level, and in people's own experience, there's a real change as well in terms of how we associate with spirituality and religion, the language that we use, and so my work kind of sits at the intersection of studying that and also participating in it, trying to create projects and offerings that speak to this growing number of people that are kind of in the messy middle when it comes to spirituality, religion, and community.
Lovely. What a crisp introduction. It's like you've done that before.
It always changes, which is a little worrying because you're not quite sure what to include and what not to. But there we go. That'll do for today.
Yeah, it'll do really well. So before I read this passage, which I want to read this passage, I'm curious how you relate to the word atheist because it's relevant.
Mm, mm. The thing that's always striking about language that describes people who are non-religious is that they are all negations.
So
Atheist.
negative.
Yeah, or like non right. It's always pointing to something and saying not that. Um, and so the most positive language maybe you could find is kind of humanist, but not everyone who's not religious would embrace that term. So it's not totally right. Um, the reason why I'm fumbling slightly around atheism is because when I came to divinity school, I described myself as training to be a minister for non-religious people, and so in some ways it's been a very helpful word to indicate kind of stepping away from the problems of institutional religion. But what I found, certainly over the last decade, is that the people who I've resonated with most as someone who I want to become more like, the people who inspire you and kind of show you the way. Um, for me, it's often ended up being religious people, not atheists. So I've certainly found myself kind of distancing myself from the word atheist because I'm not one anymore. And I don't fully know what God means, and I don't think anybody does, but I am certain that I'm no longer comfortable just saying, well, I'm not someone who is interested in those questions because I think about them all the time. So it can be a strategically helpful word, but it's not very descriptive of where I am right now. Yeah. How about you?
maybe you should go into politics, man. That was a that was a really long and complicated answer to a very simple question.
Well, it's not a simple question, because like the language that we use to describe our spirituality is one of the things that's become so much more complicated since more and more of us don't fit into these boxes. And so any words that people use become like tainted or like layered with meaning where you're like, well, I want this part but not that part. So I kind of have
Yeah.
to turn it into like a full menu rather than just a simple I'll take a sandwich.
Yeah. No, no, you're right. And to answer your question, I find myself in a very similar position,
Mm,
but with a different strategy, maybe, is that I'm still really attached to the word atheist. Like
mm,
I like to describe myself as an atheist. I relate to people who are atheists,
yeah.
and I feel like I have this important contribution to make to the atheist community,
Beautiful.
which is about spirituality and magic and mysticism.
Do you know what it's really good at is indicating theological safety. So for people for whom religious language can be um, really uncomfortable, claiming that atheist language is a really powerful way of being like, that's not what I'm about,
Yeah, yeah,
but I do want us to like open our eyes to the mystery, right? And I think that's a really smart move. Plenty of people will respond to that.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then there's so much. I mean, the last time we talked, which was the motivation for having this podcast, I just felt so much common ground with you and so much
Mm,
like possibility of receiving mentorship, which I'm really grateful for. But but so as part of that conversation, you were like, "Hey, you should check out this article called The Priestliness of the Human Heart."
yeah.
And I did, and I was just blown away.
Isn't
And
it beautiful? I'm
it's
so glad you
beautiful.
liked it.
Oh, so I'm gonna read the first paragraph of it.
Oh, great,
And
great.
then I want to ask you just kind of like what's alive in you in that moment
Yeah,
and also what role that's had in your life. But
beautiful.
I'll just read it. Behind the veneer of our external lives, the eternal is at work. The eternal is an unseen and ancient presence. In and through the daily round of work, confusion, fear, and hope, it is quietly creative.
Mm,
The eternal is patient and subtle. Its rhythms are oblique and shy. Each human is a crest of threshold in which the temporal grounds in the eternal and through which the eternal suffuses the temporal.
mm,
Yes. There is a secret immensity in every life. There is a depth and an outreach in us that we seldom glimpse. And in its subtle wisdom, the eternal carefully designs a unique destiny for each person. To be born is to be chosen. You have a task of creativity to realize here that no one else can accomplish.
mm. It just makes me like teary-eyed. I love it.
Me too.
So I should say like where this comes from because I think it's really helpful to understand the context and to engage with those words.
Please.
Um, so John O'Donoghue was an Irish poet and priest and academic. But what I love so much about him is he always said that his second favorite thing that he ever did was to become a Catholic priest, and his favorite thing that he ever did was to leave the priesthood. And so he lived his life at the edge of the sacred and of the secular. He did his PhD um, he was looking at religious history and theology, but also at philosophy. So he was always kind of crossing these bridges and raging against the institution of the Catholic Church. He was for priests being able to marry. He was for priests, not having to be celibate. So he was a real radical within that system. and ended up falling in love with a woman and leaving the priesthood. But his poetry and his kind of spiritual imagination was so rich and so resonant with a really large number of people. So he wrote a lot, and you see it coming through a little bit in the language there. He wrote a lot using imagery from the natural world, and he grew up on the west coast of Ireland. So there's like a rough kind of Celtic spiritual magic in his writing. And it's so interesting, right? Because what do you make of the word eternal that he uses in that phrase so much? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, for me, I'm looking for a way to tap into the magic that I know is there without getting offended by some
Yeah,
word I already have connotations with.
yeah,
And eternal just passes that test. Like I
so
don't need to
good,
know what it
right?
means.
Yeah,
I don't know what it means, but I'm just like,
yeah,
okay, he didn't say Jesus and he didn't
yeah,
say God, and
yeah,
I'm stoked about that.
yeah, yeah. But it feels like I don't know what it means like in my head, but I know what it means in my heart. Maybe
Yeah.
that like that's is that does that feel right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And he's leading us, I mean, to this thing that I felt like I felt it my whole life, which is
yeah.
that every yeah, I was first tuned into it with humans, but I think it's probably also true with other beings. But that
Mm,
every being is just like infinite in its
mm,
magnificence.
mm.
And I studied math, and there's this thing in math. God, I don't know if I'll be able to explain this well. Um,
You're talking to someone who failed their econometrics exam in graduate school because I fell in love that semester, which my professor did not give as a valid excuse. So I had to retake that whole class.
well, there's some hope for us because this is totally different branch of math. I'm talking about
Okay,
like
good.
group theory, number theory. And I don't know if you ever done anything like that. Okay,
No,
I'm gonna
need
try
to
and use
be.
an example with a clock. And the clock is not a great example, but maybe, gosh, maybe this is gonna work. The basic idea is that in a group theory is like instead of having an infinite number line where the numbers just
Mm,
like, man, they just keep on going, there's a limited amount. And
yeah,
so with a clock, there's 12. And it's the same with the months, there's 12. And so if you have a month like, okay, stick with the clock. If you have a time, 3 o'clock, and you add 10 hours to it, what's 10 hours after 3 o'clock?
right. You're going to 1 o'clock rather than
1 o'clock.
yeah,
And you
yeah.
switch the AM PM thing, right?
Right,
But it's not going to be 13 because we
right.
just got 1 to 12, right? Um, okay. So in group theory, you can do that with different kinds of operations. Doesn't really make sense with the clock, but that's like 3 plus, what do we say? 3 plus 10. You could also have like 3 times 9, which is
Mm,
like kind of hard to imagine. I guess you could wait 9 hours 3 times. And
right.
if you do that, it's 27 hours later. And so if you started at midnight, 27 hours later is going to be 24 hours later, and then another 3 is going to be 3. And
Yeah,
so in a sense, like 9 times 3 is 3,
very cool.
right?
Very cool.
And so if you get into this a little bit more, it turns out that if this is this is just awesome. If you square a number,
Uh-huh.
it's some other number, and sometimes so you can take that to a higher power. So like 5 squared is 5 times 5. You might have 5 times 5
Right.
is 5, 5 cubed, or 5 to the 4th, 5 to the 5th. And sometimes that will get to 1.
Mm,
And that 1 is also known as unity. And so then you can see like, oh, in multiple different numbers, if you take them to different powers, we'll end up at 1.
whoa.
And so so we say, oh, 1 has multiple roots of unity.
Huh.
And there's certain kinds of groups where
Whoa.
every number is a root of
No.
unity.
Whoa. That's cool.
So, okay, that was a little bit of a log of, I'm glad you like that. I don't know if anyone listening without my hand signs is going to get that at all, unless they already knew it. But to me, I feel that with beings, that like we are all
Mm,
these roots of unity, that we
mm,
have all of this possibility and this
mm.
infiniteness. in us. Although, like he's saying, what does he say here? There is a depth and an outreach in us that we seldom glimpse. Like most of
Mm,
the time, we're just like honking at some person because they cut us off.
for real. Or in my case, they were walking in the bike lane
Yeah.
after I was ringing like so much and was like, yo. And then they turn around and look at me and act as if I'm the asshole. I'm like, what do you want me to
Spoken like a true Dutchman. That was very
do? Seriously,
stereotypical. Yeah.
it's my total pet peeve.
Wow. Yeah. So how does that inform, especially that last bit? To be born is to be chosen. You have a task of creativity to realize here that no one else can accomplish. Do you
Mm.
relate to that?
Honestly, where my mind goes is slightly thinking theologically in the sense that and again, I didn't grow up with a religious tradition, but Christianity is kind of like the language that I speak, just because of growing up in the UK and now living in the US. That's the kind of theological language I'm most familiar with. The Jewish one also more so since moving to the US. But in the Hebrew Bible, the very first thing that God does is to create. And so there's some wonderful theological writers who talk about that the most holy thing you can do is to create, because it's the first thing that God did. And so where my mind goes when you read that sentence is like, yeah, that makes sense, right? Like in a kind of spiritual sense, is that that's the thing that is the most holy part of us, is the instinct and the capacity to create, whether it's creating art obviously as one, but to create experiences, relationships, to create um you know situations where people experience kindness. Like there's so much that we can create, and that's what I hear in that invitation is yeah, that there's a maybe even a sense of human agency hidden in that phrase as well, that we get to choose, that we have capacity to choose what we create. um, but it's this lovely, I like how he talks about the eternal and the temporal connecting, right? Like that, yes, we live in time and space, and yet through us or in us or between us, there is this eternal something. And even if you're just thinking on a very um, kind of biological level, right? Like I read somewhere recently, I love this, that like death is not the opposite of life. The opposite of death is birth. Life just is.
Hmm.
And so, like, even if all that is eternal is just life itself. Uh, it's connecting, right, with our particular expression of life for these however many decades that we get to be alive. So it's that eternal and temporal connecting. Um, yeah,
Wow.
I
Yeah.
love O'Donoghue. It's so good. It's so good. And you're so right. Like it doesn't have some of those words that just immediately set my skin crawling, right? Or immediately put me in a place where I already know what I think about this. It's so invitational and generous in its language. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And then later in the essay, first of all, it took me like an hour to read the first three. I'll just like kind of drift off and be like, oh.
Wow. It's trippy. Yeah.
Yeah, really, really, really beautiful. But then he starts critiquing modern life.
Hmm.
Then he critiques the church and institutional religion. And those parts were much less kind of interesting to me because I've just done a lot of that. It's like I don't need any critiques of organized religion. I'm just so over it that it's not even relevant. And but we can tell
Totally.
that for another
And he's
audience.
writing in the 90s. Yeah, like it's
Yeah.
such a different time. Yeah.
Yeah. But that those parts were probably like really meaty and challenging for people in his fold at that time that are like, whoa, this
For
is so
sure.
intense. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And I love that, his whole argument is really about the failures of the Catholic Church in his case, and the kind of clericalism that has emerged, right? The sense that someone who is ordained, someone who is a priest, has some sort of unique or privileged access to the divine. Um, and his whole point is that priestliness is something that is in every human heart, and that what the ordination within an institution like the church, what ordination is about is a recognition of a thing that is already there, and that each of us has that capacity, which, if anyone's engaged in Christian cultural or theological conversations, right, you could hear the echoes of the Reformation there. But that isn't to undo kind of core Catholic teaching, but it is to shift how we understand spiritual authority. And so it is a radical invitation. He's if you haven't yet listened to an interview with him, he has such a great sense of humor. And anyone with a good Irish accent, I mean, just like I'm in, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. So easy that way. So easy that way.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed that too, Anka. It's such a special text. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's beautiful. And just to kind of flesh out what you said a little bit for the audience who hasn't read this yet, but maybe they will. He talks about implicit and explicit priestliness, and
Yeah.
the idea is that we all have this like potential, we all have this connection with the divine. That means we all have this implicit priestliness. And the point of the external priest, the only point,
Mm,
is to help us realize that we're all different.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that our priestly nature is about helping us to remember that everything is sacred, right? Like it's that's the gift of the priest is to have that level of consciousness, or to have that presence and awareness to see that everything is connected, to see that everything is holy. There is no desecration. There is only holiness. And yeah, exactly. The explicit priest, right? The people in the robes and with the all of the to me it's just like drag, honestly. All I see is basically like churches drag queens. Right, and it's by pointing to something and making it kind of ridiculous that you actually see what it is, and it's true. It's like, yeah, it's a character. There's an authority that comes with that is not yours, but it's bestowed on you by the community, by the tradition. But yeah, exactly. The purpose is not to berate or to exclude, but to welcome everyone back to that part of themselves that has that connection to the sacred. Yeah.
Hmm. That's awesome. And it reminds me of something. I would like to read something else to you.
Mm,
There's actually part of what made my morning so difficult in my last 24 hours so difficult.
mm.
I have a really good friend and mentor who I've interviewed a number of times on this podcast. His name is John Giuliano. And I met him in the year 2000. He came and gave a talk at my university, and he'd already been living in El Salvador for many years at that point, and he's been there now for 40 years. And I don't know
Wow.
if you're following the current political situation in El Salvador.
Not as much as I should be.
Yeah, it's very intense. So I'll just give
Mm,
like a high level overview. So El Salvador had a civil war in the 80s. There was a peace agreement in 1992, I believe. And like many conflicts, it was ended but not healed.
mm,
And
mm,
that's alive and what's going on right now. And there were also like a lot of refugees that fled to the
mm,
US.
mm,
And over the course of the next, I don't know how many, I don't know the exact history or sociology of it, but there's a lot of gang activity in Southern California where a lot of these people left to, and then they were deported sometimes, some of them to El Salvador. And then I don't think that's the only reason, but that's one of the factors that there was like a lot of gang activity in El Salvador.
yeah.
And that has become like a really big deal. And there's been a lot of, it's like the murder capital of the world in San Salvador for a number of years. And there's been a lot of lack of safety. And so the recent
Mm,
president was elected a few years ago, Nayib Bukele. One of his campaign promises or one of his platforms was like reducing crime. And so I don't know all the different strategies he's used, but one of them has been to suspend a lot of civil liberties and put
mm,
young people who look like they might be in a gang or just young, it seems, in jail,
mm.
which is I think pretty effective in terms of reducing crime. Because so in statistics, there's like this is the part you may have missed in the econometrics class. There's like There's like type 1 errors and type 2 errors. I don't know if you remember that part.
Okay, yeah, definitely not my home language. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a good framework for life. The type 1 errors where are you like you're not putting enough people in jail. You're kind of under specifying. And the type 2 are like you're putting more people in jail than you need to. So you're putting innocent
Mm,
people in jail. So that one of them is, and I don't know remember if I got that right, which is one and which is two. But on one of the errors, there's like guilty people that are not being tried. And the other error, there's like people in jail who are innocent and have also not been tried. And that's where Bukele is right now.
mm, mm,
And so my friend John, who has run this youth organization for many years, is, really concerned about this. And people that work with him and work for him and his kids that he's overseeing are getting
yeah.
thrown in jail. And, I think there's been 100,000 people put in jail
Wow.
recently, and there's no
Wow.
hearings or trials or any of that machinery. And we don't know how many of those people are. We don't know. We know that they're not getting tried. We don't know how many are like actually, guilty or innocent. But we think there's maybe 20% or 20,000 who are totally
Mm,
innocent and just
mm,
wrong place, wrong time, or like somebody just denounced them for whatever political or social reason.
yeah.
So yesterday, John's village was surrounded by 5,000 soldiers, and he's like, "Hey, you're not sure what's going on over here. They've kind of occupied this whole zone of the country." And I was really concerned. I studied the war in El Salvador. I read books about entire villages being massacred not so
Mm,
long ago, and I was really concerned all night that I would wake up and I would
mm,
never hear from John again. But he was alive, and he sent me this message this morning that I really want to celebrate, celebrate him, celebrate humanity, and also, I mean, to me, this really ties into the work that
mm,
you and I do, and that quote from John O'Donohue. We are all okay. There are 5,000 soldiers here, complete occupation. I've spent the morning talking to soldiers. We have to humanize this situation. They
mm,
don't want to be here either. I've allowed them to sleep at the Tamarindo, that's
mm,
like their community center, to use our restrooms, although I did give them my strict orders to keep everything clean. At the end, as in all cases, love and kindness are the answer,
mm.
even when you're being watched with 5,000 guns in your face.
Ooh, yeah, I feel that. Well, I'm glad he's safe and sound. Um, and what an incredible testament to his, I mean, my language would be like spiritual maturity to be able to be met with such aggression and to respond with such tenderness. That's genuinely remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he's an amazing person. I was like fully in like my peak atheism when I met him
Mm, mm,
and went down and spent a month living with him in El Salvador at winter break my senior year in college. And it was the first time I was exposed to liberation theology. And he was
mm.
a former Jesuit, and
Wow,
it was totally opened something in my heart that because
that's
it's like
so
he's
beautiful.
living the Gandhian dream in a way, you know?
Honestly, Ankur, that's the thing that I come back to every time. When I mentioned before that like I kept meeting people, it was because they were living differently. They were living what I knew I wanted to do, but was maybe too afraid to, or didn't have the support to, whatever the reasons. I could see that the way they were living was the way that I knew I should be living too, and I'm just so attracted to that. Like I just want that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And it
Yeah.
and nearly always, no, I mean pretty much always, they were religious, but also at the edge of their own system. Because actually the institutions often push people to the kind of norm, the normie behavior.
Yeah.
It's these like radicals that are sustained by this deep spiritual conviction or set of practices, or there's something in them that allows them to risk everything to live out what they know to be true. I just find that absolutely like disruptively inspiring.
Yeah.
And it's why I've kept coming back to questions around spirituality and religion rather than remaining at a political level, because I was an activist in my kind of youth and worked professionally in the nonprofit world. And there was so much there that I appreciate and value, and that is enormously helpful, but it was also incomplete. And so it feels like, hearing a story like John's, like, there's strategy there, there's organizational skills, there's all sorts of great stuff that has totally secular application and inspiration, but at the same time there is a profound depth of conviction and trust and like sacrificial love that is willing to encounter, yeah, as you said, that risk of violence with love. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and you're totally right. In terms of hitting the limits of the institution, because he was a Jesuit in training and was
Mm,
kicked out in the
yeah,
80s because he was
right.
too radical.
Yeah,
He was
yeah,
helping all these people he wasn't supposed to help.
yeah.
And they're like, no, no, you can't do this anymore.
I some the My favorite conversation partners in all of this work over the last few years have been these nuns, again, Catholic sisters. We're talking a lot about Catholics today. That's very interesting. But these are women who at 18 went into a convent, just like a completely different life, and yet who, um, in some ways, very much embodying the gospel, the Christian gospel of helping those in need, and feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and all the rest of it. Um, and worked with people with HIV, and worked with single mothers, and supported people, um, working in all sorts of professions that the church would perhaps not condone. And Rome, the Catholic Church investigated these American nuns and basically told them that they had been unfaithful to their tradition and had not embodied the tradition. Um, and it does seem to be a remarkable repeated story that the people who are most embodying what the tradition is all about get punished, because it challenges some of the ways in which these institutions, just in the way that institutions do, right? Whether it's the monarchy, the legal system, the church, media, it's just very, very difficult when money meets mission to keep choosing mission, because it's not rewarded. And I think the reason why I get so inspired by these kind of people is like, what was in place to help them make those brave decisions? Like, was it that they lived in community? Was it that they had a prayer practice? Was it something that they were born with? Like, that's the question I keep coming back to. Like, why were they able to do that when I seem so absolutely unable to do it?
Wow. Beautiful. Beautiful. No, thank you for your honesty too. Yeah, I have the same question. With John, just since he's on my mind, he grew up in the Bronx. He grew up in New York with the Catholic worker, like Dorothy Day,
Mm-hmm.
and Dan and Phil Berrigan were like two of his.
Wow.
They were the people he was
Wow.
hanging out with when he was in middle school.
Casual.
Yeah. So I think that's
That'll
I think
do it.
that's
Yeah.
probably a big influence.
Well, I mean, it's true, right? If you see that it's possible, and you see people living lives that, might not be financially rewarding, but my goodness, they're relationally rich and filled with meaning and beauty. You see that a different way of living is possible. And I think for so many of us, we just haven't had, yeah, we've just not seen that another way as possible. I love Walter Brueggemann's work around the prophetic imagination, that helping people imagine differently, um, changes how the world is. And I think you see that more and more in activist spaces now, with things like Afrofuturism, and helping us imagine different futures, so we don't feel constrained to think within a GDP bound system, or
Yeah.
the kind of economic system that we live within, that's the only reality that's possible, because it isn't.
Yeah, and I think that was a really important part of the activist movement when I was more of a part of it many years ago now. But that whole like the first World Social Forums and just
Yeah,
like the slogan like "Un otro mundo es posible." It's like
totally.
not just about criticizing how horrible the big companies are. It's really
Right.
positive and imaginative because the negativity was just it doesn't it's not inspiring.
It's not. But to say another world is possible is also very confronting and scary because it means that we can't hold on to the things that we know that we know. So it's uh, there's a tenderness needed, I think, as we do that imagining to like kind of grieve the old world too, because there's
Yeah.
um I'm rewarded plenty in the old world. Plenty of people are not, right? I want to be careful to not speak in blanket statements here, but for a lot of us, we're able to navigate this world relatively well. It's just that we're lonely and medicated and like all the other things that like just come as embedded within this kind of cultural norm. And moving our inner dial to be willing to risk um, is yeah, it's frightening. And so that's why I'm so passionate about the community work, because I think it's very difficult to make those kind of jumps by yourself. Like we need each other. You need
Yeah.
those cultures of shared commitment to be able to try something different.
Yeah, 100%. So tell us a little bit about that. And then I have a question I want to ask you, but I think it's going to benefit from us hearing about the community work.
Yeah, totally. So um, I'll tell this story in two halves. The first half is more on the kind of research side, which is that when I was in divinity school and learning all of these fascinating things, and ways in which traditional religious communities were designed, and which some of my classmates were being trained to lead, I was really curious about, well, where are people like me, who are not members of a religious tradition? Where are we going to find community? And that led to a project with my colleague Angie Thurston that we called How We Gather, where we kind of mapped how secular institutions were doing religious things. So people getting married in a CrossFit, gym, people asking their soul cycle instructor to talk to them about the loss of their mother, there's kind of pastoral care conversations. People hosting Thanksgiving in their maker space and creating all sorts of interesting little creative projects to sit next to the potluck dinner that they created together. So all of these ways in which these new secular communities were gathering, but when you looked at what was happening within them, people were doing very religious things. And what that meant was that for the leaders of those communities, not only did they have to know how to safely, do a bench press, they also needed to know, like, well, how do you talk to someone if they've been diagnosed with cancer? Right? There was a very different skill set that they were being asked to do. And so we started to interview those leaders and host gatherings of them, and to start to see them as kind of a new distribution system for spiritual well-being. So rather than just looking at congregations, looking at this much bigger landscape of projects and communities that were doing the kind of religious things that previously congregations would have done. And that included a whole set of digital, leaders, whether they were spiritual influencers or, apps, and some of them still, had some relationship to religion, some were not at all. So it was just this whole new landscape. And I was part of creating in that landscape too. I created a podcast with my co-founders Vanessa Zoltan and Ariana Nedelman called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where we read the Harry Potter books as if they were a sacred text. And so each week we'd read a chapter through a particular theme and engage with traditional Christian and Jewish reading practices to see, not just this text as a fan would and kind of escape the world by getting into the story, but to see it really as a mirror and ask, what can we learn about ourselves by reading this text? Because even if the text stays the same week to week, our lives change. And so we see new things about our own experience. And so these projects and later some more really kind of have been very fertile in kind of imagining what might be possible. And most recently, I've been working on a project called Nearness, where I feel like many of us are kind of overwhelmed with content, even if it's great content, But the thing that's often missing are the containers for connection. And so we know that to really integrate something, you need space and time and attention to really sit with a question or sit with a inspiring source, whether it's a text or a video or whatever. And so we created Nearness, which is a program that matches you into a small group with 5, 6 other people, in which you meet every week for 90 minutes on Zoom to explore life's biggest questions together and hopefully experience that sense of deep connection together. And so we've been doing that for about 18 months now. Over 1,000 people have gone through these journeys. And it's been really beautiful to see how these peer facilitated small groups. So there's no coach, there's no leader, there's no staff member. What we give people is a script, is what we call a guide sheet, which gives people a series of prompts. And some of them are journaling prompts, some of them are short guided meditations, some of them are conversation starters. And essentially, it leads people through a sort of little liturgical script. And so over those 90 minutes, you have a series of conversations that you have together that really lead to that sense of deep connection. And it's all online, but which has pros and cons, which we can talk about. But I'm really interested in projects like this that kind of build the social and spiritual infrastructure that helps us be less alone and more grounded in the things that we know to be true.
Wow. Wow. Okay, I got lots of questions. So, okay, just so I remember keywords: friendship,
Mm,
example, and civil war. Those are just things in my mind.
great. Okay. Just a short little menu of
Yeah.
offerings.
So, what is the relationship of this to friendship? Like the people that go through this, is it because they don't have friendships? Is it because these questions are off limits, or just what in their current friendships? Like, what's the how does that relate?
It, it's very, very insightful. It depends. And it's been really interesting. For some people, they are genuinely looking for more friends. I think, especially in midlife, when people have had kids, they've moved, they've left a job where they had a lot of friends. There's so many ways in which people kind of wake up one day and are like, man, I don't really have a lot of friends. So, like, they're looking to build those kind of meaningful relationships. Others, as you said, might have a set of friendships which are beautiful and meaningful, but where some of these conversations are just difficult to get to. Maybe their friends are not interested in them, or they have very different perspectives. And so there's actually a delight in having the safety of strangers with whom you can have these conversations, because there's no stake, right, that this other person has in you agreeing or disagreeing or whatever it is. There's an ease in being able to discuss these kind of spiritual conversations with people who are not connected to your everyday life. And so it's interesting because the two groups behave very differently over time. The groups that are looking for friends, and we try and match for these two typologies because they want different things from the experience.
Yeah.
The folks who are looking for friends keep meeting, either through the formal programs. People have been together in a small group for over 18 months now, or they independently organize. We've had groups travel across the country to be together. We've had romances start. Like, it's all sorts of really interesting examples of people really looking for those continuing relationships. And then there's others who really appreciated the time and space to explore these questions and reflect on their own spiritual life in some way, who are then, after 8 weeks, say, wow, this was great. Great score, 9 out of 10. But that was it. Like, I'm done. Peace. I got what I wanted from this experience.
Yeah.
And so those two groups behave pretty differently. What I would say is that for any group that is looking for friends, with the small exception of people who are mostly housebound, right? Because there are a number of folks who aren't able to leave home as easily as you and I. The way in which those friendships really get cemented are when people connect in person. So there's a desire to kind of go from the digital to IRL. Whereas the people who enjoyed the safety of strangers, there's actually, it's great that it's digital, because I'm not going to run into you in the grocery store.
Yeah. Yeah. And to serve that former population, I don't know if that's something you're interested in, but have you Is there a conference? Is there like a thing where everyone who does the nearness can get together and party for a weekend?
We've talked about it. We've talked about it. The vision was originally a summer camp, which I still think could be really cool. So, um, and there was definitely, even when we were writing How We Gather a decade ago, one of the kind of categories was adult summer camps. Camp Grounded was one that was really big at that point. Soul Camp and a few others. So there's definitely a theme there. So who knows? Not quite yet, but maybe one day.
Okay. Well, if you do that and you want a camp counselor, that's really my destiny.
That's. I was going to say. I feel like you at birth you actually got a little labeled, camp counselor in waiting.
100%. Of all the different jobs I've had in my life, being an RA at Stanford, that was like, I think that's the high point. It was the high point of my career. It was amazing.
That's so funny. I was the equivalent at Harvard, and I can't say it was my high point, but I think I did a good job. I got better than average ratings. I'll say that.
Okay. Friendship example. So could you share with us a little bit of like what the format might be for one of these 90-minute sessions or a couple of the prompts or questions or just to give
Yeah,
people.
absolutely. Yeah, so it's very consistent. One of the things we found was it's really comforting for people to know what the structure is. And so there's 5 sections that we come back to time and time and again. So the first one we call Get Present, and it's just a very simple exercise just to help people arrive in this moment, this time, coming from a meeting or childcare or travel, whatever it is, just to settle in. And so we use a very simple body and breath awareness practice, just 2, 3 minutes, paying attention to your breath, paying attention to how it feels in your body, paying attention to what thoughts and emotions are coming up, and then kind of orienting yourself to be present. So that's always how we start. Um, the second kind of section is about committing to kindness. And this is one of my favorite practices, which we call the nearness agreements, but it's really a covenanting practice where you commit together to a certain set of ways of being. And so we have a very short but poetically written set of commitments that we invite someone in the group to read aloud every single week. So it's really made present every single time. And through that, it's really a shared intention setting practice. Everyone is reminded of the way in which we want to be together. And in the first week and halfway through, we invite people to notice, what might I struggle with among these commitments, and how can I like live into that as best I can. So, section 2, commit to kindness. Section 3 is where we kind of go inward to the first step of reflection. And so we call it reflect deeply. And so this might be it could be simple as 3 questions for you to journal on for 10 minutes. I was putting together a guide sheet today, which was about life and death. So I would, simple questions like, what do you want to happen with your body when you die? What what were the other questions? Basically a series of questions that are open-ended, that are, there's not a yes and no answer, but might be questions that we might think about sometimes but don't really spend a lot of time with. So they can be practical like that, or it could be like, in response to a piece of poetry, what stands out to you from this poem? What images or metaphors are really resonant with you on this reading? So something that kind of goes internal. Sometimes that could be a visualization. Sometimes it could be in response to a text, like the poem, for example. But all of this third section is about kind of going inward. Then the fourth section is about sharing and listening. And so each person gets the opportunity to share. And at first, we're pretty structured with how we invite people to share. So it says, you have 4 minutes to share, and there's 2 minutes in which people can resonate or offer their thanks or ask open-ended questions. So we're pretty kind of strict with that at first while everyone gets the vibe. And then as the journey progresses, there's more spaciousness. And we basically then say, hey, you have an hour, make sure everyone has a chance to share, make sure there's space between each one just to take some silence before the next person speaks. So share and listen is section 4. And then finally, section 5 is offering gratitude. So that's an opportunity to celebrate one another, thank one another. We have a little blessing that we invite people to read at the end of the session, and that kind of closes out the kind of the formal elements of the conversation, and people carry on with their day. And that structure very quickly, even though the content changes from week to week in terms of the questions you're being asked or the exercises that you're doing, the structure stays the same. And that really helps people feel a sense of control and comfort from week to week.
Wow, beautiful. Can you share the kindness covenant? Do you have it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we can link in the show notes to an example of the guide sheet. But here I can read it aloud. Um, yeah, it changes a little bit depending on the theme of the journey, but this is kind of the raw material. We gather to honor our deepest humanity, listening to each other with an open, tender presence, showing patience as we attempt to articulate our innermost intuitions, cherishing the beautiful resonance between us when we share our struggles, practicing humility by resisting the urge to give advice, honoring our shared silence as an antidote to the world's noisiness, and opening ourselves to something larger than us, which inspires us to love others, ourselves, and the world around us. Though we may travel different paths, may we find comfort and hope in the gift of each other's company.
So beautiful. Thank you. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
you're
How many
welcome.
people have done this?
So each group is about 5 to 7 people, and each journey that we do is about 50 groups. So we've had over, I think it's like 1,250 people or something now go through this. Yeah, yeah. And it's honestly my favorite thing is hearing how people kind of take this experience and then say, I was having a frustrating moment with my husband, and I brought him a guide sheet, and I said, "This is how I want us to have a conversation." Or, the way in which people kind of adapt it and bring it into their own lives is just really beautiful. So, yeah, I think it really is an opportunity to kind of, there's some skills in here. I'm such a talker, if that wasn't already obvious. Like having that discipline of having to stay quiet after someone has shared and really like just let that silence hold before I respond does not come naturally. So yeah, there's some skill building in it too.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Casper, do you have to go at the top of the hour?
No, no, I've got until like until 20 past if that works.
Okay, great. Awesome. So this reminds me, have you heard of Black Elephant?
No.
Okay, so I had the opportunity to participate in this amazing social experience, social network that it's kind of similar. It's called Black Elephant, but often
Oh,
it's in person. There is the virtual one.
beautiful.
The guy who started it, his name is Felix, or I think there's a group, but the guy I met, his name is Felix, would travel around. I think he's done it like 500 times in the past few
Mm,
years, and he'll
wow.
gather 12 people who are strangers in a living room and go through
Mm,
a similar evening where it's like 2 or 3 hours. There's usually food, and there's
mm,
3 rounds of questions, and the
beautiful.
questions are all quite intimate, like similar, I'm guessing, to the questions that you'll pose. And each person has, I think it's 2 or 3 minutes to answer, and there's
Beautiful.
no response. It's
Yeah.
it's just like witnessing and holding
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
understanding the similarity or the difference or the fundamental, humanity or whatever emerges. And
Mm,
it's quite powerful.
yeah. It's so funny. Like it's such a simple structure, right? But it totally helps you get to that depth. And I think that non-responding in the case of the example you were just mentioning, for us, one of the really key things that I just read aloud in the intentions was not giving advice. And that's what we found is one of the most challenging but important elements of that kind of social design because it shuts down people's vulnerabilities very quickly when
Yeah.
they think they're going to get, even when it comes from like it comes from a place of wanting to be helpful. You don't want to see someone else suffer. So you're like, have you heard about internal family systems therapy, or have you checked out your enneagram? Like it's been helpful to us, so we want to share it. But yeah, it's one of the most important things that we really stress in the onboarding process, and see that desire to advise, and then try and just push it back down, and just say thank you. That's Oprah's big tip that I'll never forget. Is like when someone's just talking at her, she'll just be like, "Thank you." Thank you.
Mm.
But
Yeah,
I'm excited to check out Black Elephant.
yeah, I think you'll like it. And now I think you can just sign up online. It was invite only for a while, but now you can just sign up and,
Nice.
and do it. It's quite yeah, it's quite powerful.
Mm.
Yeah. And so the other thing I wanted to ask, and this seems like
Civil
fruitful
War. Yeah.
enough. Civil War, that's right. It seems fruitful that I may enlist your help with this project. But I have this project where I'm interested in contributing to the
Mm,
prevention of a civil war in the next 7 months. And it seems to me that at a starting point, it's gonna look something a lot like the nearness or
mm,
black elephant. Like for me, what I want to do is go below the opinions and the contention to understand the underlying emotions and needs that we all
mm,
share, and certainly we all share in terms of intensity, and use the emotions that the conflict brings up in us as a way of building community and building connection.
mm,
So
mm,
rather than like the debate about abortion being a divisive thing, like in what ways could we bring up that really thorny subject for a lot of people such that it brings us together?
mm.
And of course, I have ideas on how to do that, but I think yours are going to be better than mine. So I want to ask you, how could we do that? How could we bring that up? Not avoid it, but bring it up in a way that it invites empathy and
Mm.
understanding.
The first word that comes to my mind is sequencing, because one of the things that has happened with the kind of rapid scaling of the number of relationships that we're exposed to is that we often have disagreement without relationship. So um, it's so different having a conversation, about abortion with your sister than it is with, you know, some person you met at a conference 3 years ago who's commenting in your feed. Um, and so, I think just building on what you were sharing there, I think you'd want to intentionally do some story sharing and relationship building before you start talking about the issue, as it were. One of my favorite things about divinity school is that we spent 4 weeks in my introduction to ministry studies seminar hearing every single person, so 20 people, share their spiritual autobiography. And we did about 3 or 4 each session, and only then did we start talking about Gregory the Great or a Buddhist scripture. Like we really got a sense of where is everyone coming from, like not just geographically but in terms of their spiritual life, before we started talking about these spiritual texts. And it totally shifted how I heard the rest of the group, but also how I spoke about my own thoughts about these texts into the group. And so I think it was a powerful experience of putting relationship at the center. Um, I I'm a little honestly, I'm a little hesitant about any. Well, I'm fumbling here because I'm speaking a little bit beyond my actual expertise. That after the 2016 election in the US, there was a wave of bridge building work, and so many new efforts that were about bringing red and blue together, which is beautiful. And when people actually engage each other in you know consultative circles or more storytelling projects or empathy training, it's amazing how much kind of the zone of potential agreement, to use that kind of negotiating term, there is between people with really pretty different political instincts. Um, but unless there's a real reason to bring up, like, unless you're making a decision about abortion together, I'm not sure of the value of bringing up the difference
Mm-hmm.
just for discussing it. So that's where my curiosity and my caution comes up,
Yeah.
um, especially if there hasn't been a lot of relational work done before. Like, why not start with something where the intensity heat is a little lower, before we get there, and what's the purpose of bringing it up? So that those are some questions I would have. because I think really one of the biggest things of like why we're in such a dangerous place in terms of the threat of even having a conversation about something like civil war is that there is so little relational capacity in people right now. Like there's the number of friends that we have is drastically down. The number of average people that we have in our homes is down drastically. The number of volunteering hours that people do is down. There's just so many ways in which structurally we are less. We're encountering one another much less, and so all that we hear about each other are these super intense depictions through media. And so I think that as citizens without any sort of institutional power, the best thing that we can do, this is why I like to host parties, is just to bring people together. Because I think any time that you even start with a like, we are going to encounter one another and listen to each other's values, a lot of people who vote Democrat are going to say yes, and a lot of Republicans are going to say no. And that's partly because it's just built into the culture of these two systems, that one has a much higher threat perception, and so just starting with like, let's barbecue together, or let's sing together, or like, let's clean up the river together, or let's make sure these kids have clothes together, like start there before we start like turning up the intensity heat. That was a long answer, but that's
Yeah,
where
no,
I'm at.
that's good. And I appreciate the question and the challenge, and I'm going to try and respond to it. I don't know how successful I'll be, but I here's my my intuition, or kind of my problem statement. So I live in this small town,
Mm,
and I've noticed that these very large, very thorny, very divisive, hot button national and international issues have an
yeah,
effect on the local community. And it's almost entirely a negative effect.
yeah.
It's a divisive, community destroying effect.
Mm.
So I want to address it, you know. So to me, the invitation is like, well, let's address this. And one of the ways that I've seen small towns address it is through passing like resolutions, like a
Yep.
resolution on the ceasefire in Gaza or something like that. You know, and to me, there's a couple things that don't work about that for me. One is that, you know, I understand it has strategic value, but there's not a direct, like, we don't have any power over that in a small town either way. It's like
Sure.
not
Sure.
you pass a resolution saying we should triple military aid to Israel. It's like it's not up to your town. So
Yeah.
that's one. But the other is the dynamics of majority based democracy, where
Yeah.
you just end up with some amount of people being disenfranchised. So, but the thing is, for me, I mean, I totally agree. It'd be way better just build relationships for a long time.
Mm,
And that's what every person I've talked to is like, and that I trust, that's what they all say. And it
mm.
makes sense and it's true. And that's what I do in my own
But we
life.
only have 7 months.
Yeah. Well, that's part of it, but it's not even the time thing. It's just that this is alive in our consciousness. It is destroying our community, whether we
Mm,
address it or not. So
mm.
it's like the damage is already being done. And so
Yeah.
I want to surface it. I want to like
But
excavate it
but
a little bit.
but I think that's where I disagree with you. I don't think the cure to that damage is to put our attention on the thing that's doing damage. I think that the cure is in finding the things that we can do together, that we can, it's that world building. It's the spiritual imagination question. It's like, let's say we live in the town of Springfield. What I would think instead is like, what can we do to make Springfield better, that people can really get on board on? And it's partly, I grew up with a mother who was like, what this town needs is crossing guards and an arts festival. And like, she still is in many ways somewhat politically naive, but an absolutely incredible community builder,
Mm,
because she never looked for the things that were different, and always for the things that were aligned.
mm,
And so like, she I think I'd learned this from her, in the sense of like, who doesn't want a like circus coming to town, or like, who doesn't want, you know a day where we have a parade and we celebrate the state bird. I don't know what it is, but like finding the thing that unites, and I know there's a naivety to it, but I think the danger of focusing on the thing that is the divider without having that unity relational stuff going on underneath is that it only makes it worse.
Yeah,
Or at
and that,
least people's perception is that, oh, this division is so deep and real. You know what I mean?
well, yeah, and so that would be the goal. So there's two goals for me here.
Yeah.
One is to get people into the same room, which what
Yeah.
you're saying in terms of like the river cleanup, that's another strategy of getting
Right.
people in the same room.
Totally.
And the question is like, if you put out a call of like, hey, come if you want to make this town a better place, or come if you want to talk about the death penalty. So the litmus test for success is how many people get in the room. That's level
100%.
one, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then level two is like, okay, is what we do in the room going to make things better or worse,
Yeah.
right? And so there's two thresholds, two criteria there. And so for the
Yeah.
second one, yeah, it would be the opposite of what I want to do if people come and then they just like yell at each other and hate each
Yeah.
other and leave the room being like, dude, fuck those people. That's like that would be making things worse. And so, which is totally a possibility, right?
Yeah.
So it's risky. It's really risky in that way. But what
And,
I'm
and
trying to come up with is a methodology or a script or a liturgy, as you put it, that
I'm
would
with you.
that would be the opposite.
I'm with you. And that's why I come back to sequencing, because I'm not saying that we should never have those conversations. That's not the solution. But I don't think you can start there. Because there has to be, it's about building that container, right? That we talked about before. It's like you have to have a way of being together that trumps the dominant cultural way of being together around that issue. And
Yeah,
all that we know now, the scripts that we have now are you kill babies and you hate women. Like
yeah.
those are the two scripts, and like that's not helping. So we have to create a different um yeah, a different way that people know how to be together that holds space for, frankly, every conversation I've had when there's real trust and vulnerability is that people on, and I hate even saying both sides of this argument because there's so many more than just two perspectives,
Sure.
but like it is complicated and there are fundamental principles that people hold on to really firmly, and I can respect that, but there's often way more nuance and confusion and suffering and fear in, just to use that abortion conversation. um Even the way we're framing that conversation is falling into one particular camp, right? Like a woman's right to choose or access to healthcare. um the, the, it's so easy to fall back into the binary that we have set up as the way we have that conversation, and I think you have to do some preparatory relational work and container building and shared visioning before it's genuinely helpful to bring up that question.
I think you're totally wrong and a bad person.
Thanks for coming to my show. But I love that this is a project that you're holding. I think it's really exciting. And the cool thing, honestly, is that I feel like so many people feel that now.
Mm.
Like, gee, everyone is fed up, and it's at the local level. I can't remember who said this, but when you're feeling hopeless, stop looking at the big, start looking at the small, right? That's where real change can happen at our human scale. That's where we see stories that inspire us, where we see changes. There's now a traffic light at the busiest crossing section because my mom campaigned for years to have that installed, and that's now there, and it wasn't before. So it's those kind of things that you're like, yeah, it can be different.
It can be different. Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
I'm
And
so glad. I really want to come visit at some point. So let's keep in touch. I really appreciate you having me on.
yeah, I would love that too, Casper. And I'm gonna, as I continue and this project evolves, I'm gonna continually seek your advice.
I'm grateful to be included. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us.
Bye bye.
Thus concludes another episode of the 10,000 Heroes Show. I'm Ankur Shah Delight. Thank you Thank you for joining me today. And if you like the show, don't be afraid. Send me a fat wad of cash. Just kidding. Just kidding. I mean, you can. But really, if you like the show and it made a difference in your life, send it to someone you know and like in the hope that it'll make a positive impact in their life. Because that's what this is all about.